Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Scyushi, and we are back with some more Trove. And today is going to end up being a fairly chill video. Most of all, I wanted to kind of tell you guys where all of the classes stand in Trove right now, because there's been a lot of discussion around it. A lot of you have been wanting my opinion on it. And frankly speaking, I think Trove is in a decent place. The biggest problem is combat block becomes a huge limiting factor for a lot of the classes at the end game. So to clarify, combat block is basically going to end up being this little ugly turtle shell that's added to your health bar. And the way that it works in this game is it's actually scaling off of health regen, and stability. The thing is, the patch notes has given people the impression that having those stats on your gear will make a difference. It doesn't. Unfortunately, it's not enough of a notable difference. If you have stability, health regen, or whatever, if you have all of that on your gear, you get like, what, 10 extra block or something stupid? It's not much. It still can add up. It can still be enough for some of the classes that don't have a lot of base block. And if I'm not mistaken, someone can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I think in order of how much it impacts your combat block, it goes health regen, and stability at the last, just in terms of stat priority, if I'm not mistaken. Again, someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But the thing is, in order to end up handling the end game, there's one of two things that you need to be able to do. So first of all, there's going to be D15. This is where a lot of classes really start to fail, just because what happens in these worlds, I know I selected the prime world, excuse me. What happens in these worlds is dungeons and enemies go beyond the limit of what most of the classes are kind of built for. And this kind of starts going into the territory of delve difficult. So a lot of the classes that aren't very good in the delves, no surprise, aren't very good in D15. That doesn't mean that you can't use them. You can most certainly use every class in the entire game within D15, and you'll be fine. However, when you end up getting into the other aspect of the end game, which is the Depths portal and the Kraken portal, those are stuck at 165, 170 depth. And when it starts getting to that point, those enemies, in particular, it's the enemies hit you so much, so hard, that if you're not playing on a class that can have a high enough amount of block to survive the whole floor, that is literally the limiting factor. It's not the damage of all of the classes. Most classes in the game will be able to handle the depths in terms of their raw damage output. The problem is survivability. And while I mentioned that having those stats on your gear doesn't make much of a difference, it can be the deciding factor to make your magic damage class, for example, just barely able to survive a whole floor before you're going to have to refresh your combat block. But unfortunately, the way that the combat block actually scales off of those stats is pretty picky. And the reason why certain classes, you've probably noticed this, certain classes will have higher base combat block than others. And that's because every class in Trove actually has hidden stats that scale as they level up. So taking the Knight, for example, he has a very high combat block. Excuse me, he's invisible. That's a mod that I have. He has very high combat block because his base core stats to his character, his health regen, and stability, all scale very high in comparison to, say, the Solarion. The Solarion doesn't end up having those stats very high when he gets to the end game. And so my Solarion only has like maybe 30 combat block, which is still enough to get me through a single floor. I'd say you need like 30, maybe 40 combat block to be able to handle the super deep delves. But again, today's video is most of all going to be focusing on which classes can you main for the depths in particular. Because like I said, you can use whatever you want when it comes to D15. I could technically even still use my Shadow Hunter in D15 if I want to. The main problem that you're going to run into, however, depending on the class that you choose, is when you get to D15, as I mentioned, they start getting very close to delve enemy territory. Not necessarily in their damage, just in terms of their raw health. They have a lot of HP. And so with having a longer time to kill on certain characters like Shadowhunter in particular, because he's a single target baller, it means that when you run into a Cursed Skull inevitably, the Shadowhunter kind of fails because he doesn't really have a good way of dispatching all of those enemies as they wander around the arena. So that's another big factor to consider when you're choosing the class that you want to main for D15. But again, like I said, today's video is most of all just going to be skimming through all of the classes and how viable they are for the depths. But now that you understand the deciding factors for a class at the end game, I'm sure you can kind of just use your own knowledge to know, oh, Knight's really good for everything in the end game, because again, he can handle the depths and he has a lot of combat block. Pirate Captain has a lot of damage, doesn't have much block. Ice Sage has a lot of damage, doesn't have much block. You can still use it in the delves though, if you're very, very particular with how much you end up getting your combat block, just enough that you can get through it. Shadowhunter kind of sucks at the end game. Not D15, just the depths, again, because he doesn't have much combat block and he's very single target. Fey Trickster, no surprise, is kind of the same. Lots of damage. Your Fey Bomb is going to destroy enemies, but unfortunately, it also knocks enemies away. And that becomes very annoying for a lot of people. Candy Barb, top tier. Just like the Knight, he's got insane combat block and also just has a lot of damage. I was using both the Knight, Candy Barb, and then even Neon Ninja for the end game for a while there. Neon Ninja, surprisingly, yeah, he's pretty dang good. You can use him in delves effectively as well, because a lot of people underestimate the Neon Ninja's raw damage output with his ultimate ability. His Shuriken is still a lot of damage, but his ult got reworked a couple years ago, and people still just have it in their mind that his ult is worthless. Gunslinger, God tier in terms of damage, might be one of the stronger classes. Apparently one of the highest tiered like end game combos is a Candy Barb pulling enemies in so that the Gunslinger can just destroy them in a second. But again, he doesn't have that much combat block, so he's a bit risky when you end up going into the depths. And again, to clarify, you can technically use all the classes in the depths. It's just that your mileage will vary based on the block stat that you have. Draco, very tanky, pretty much invincible. Great for the depths, especially if you have it built correctly. I'm missing a lot of the magic nodes because I have the physical nodes. Boomer is kind of the standard go-to for a lot of people with the end game, and I totally understand why. He's a very good all-around. You know, the main issue that I have with him is he's not very fast, which is why I already made a video that talked about the best all-around class being the Neon Ninja. And that's just because he does have the damage to kill things very fast. He also doesn't have the issue of, you know, single target with enemies wandering around, but most of all, it's because of his movement speed. That's what makes a big difference in terms of how fast he can get to the next dungeon and how fast he can destroy it. But Boomer is just going to be the safe all-around bet for a lot of people. Tomb Raiser is another one of those classes that's fairly powerful. I think it's safe to say that the Draco is slightly stronger than him right now. Most of all because Draco, you can just put your max output of damage right away by having all of your Draco babies. Whereas Tomb Raiser, you have to raise your minions. Then you gotta increase their health to purple. Then you gotta use your ult. Like, there's this time before you end up dealing your maximum amount of damage. And that's what kind of holds the Tomb Raiser back. But other than that, he's still phenomenal. Revenant is also insanely good right now. He's not very fun though, because like the Knight right now, you just hold left click. That's your max amount of damage output. I'm not even kidding. Revenant, you want to know what you do differently? You toggle on your spirit spears and then you just hold your left click, which is not a sweeping attack. It's actually a poking attack. But yeah, Revenant does have the added advantage of his ultimate pulling enemies in. So that's really useful. And he's a powerhouse. He has been for a very long time. He also gets decent block as well. So you can use him in the delves. Lunar Lancer, Lunar Lancer doesn't have much block, and unfortunately, he would be very viable for the end game, more particular because his grappling hook, you know, it works so much better now that the servers are stable, and his grappling hook is very, very useful, not only for dungeoning, but also for delves, in particular depths. You're underwater, and so if you don't end up getting the buff for that delve that makes it so that the water doesn't affect you, you're going to be slow falling. So the Lancer can end up rectifying that. And Lancer is very, very good at speeding his way to the Cursed Skull while everybody else kills things. The main reason isn't because the Lancer's damage output is bad. Damage output is actually pretty good, but Lancer is broken right now. And he's been broken for years. I just didn't know. Because when you end up triggering your ultimate ability, you can't consume a flask until you wait for your character to go back to his starting position of his animation. You attack once, you gotta wait until he finally, I'm in my default stance position. Then you can consume a flask. It's so stupid. I don't know why it does that, but it's very frustrating. Chloromancer, he's kind of in a weird place right now because I personally wouldn't really recommend him. He's very powerful in terms of his damage, but doesn't have much block. Probably not the best when it comes to the delves. I don't know. You could probably still use it for the end game, but it's not going to be a very fast class for D15. Dino Tamer, on the other hand, very fast class, has the lowest block in the game as far as I understand. So not very good for the delves. He's okay. He's one of those classes, he doesn't have energy, so you can just jump around to avoid enemy attacks, but that's a really annoying play style, and especially if you're with a group of people, it can be doubly annoying because you might be luring the enemies around the arena. So usually your best bet is to just jump straight in the air, throw your net down. You'll have the damage, but I wouldn't recommend it in the delves. Vanguardian, a surprising heavy hitter, not for the ranged mode. The ranged mode is still garbage to this very day. But when you're in your melee mode, if you do your right-click laser and then you end up having the emblem that restores your energy on your flask use, you basically spam laser flash over and over, and he actually has really good damage. You'd be surprised. And his number one ability in melee mode anyways does have slight pull on enemies. He's still not like the best option, especially when it comes to the delves, but he's viable. Yeah, you can definitely use him for the delves, especially over some of the AREN classes that we talked about. Bard. Oh boy. Bard is, Bard's okay. Like he's, the reason why Bard kind of sucks, at least in terms of depths, like you can still use him in normal farming situations, but the biggest issue that a lot of Bard mains already know is you have to keep all of your songs in check. So you got to have your movement speed song so that you can speed farm from dungeons, and you got to have your damage node, your damage song going so that you and everybody around you is actually dealing more damage, which can be very, very useful, especially in the depths. The problem is you don't have much block on this guy, and unfortunately, you're like, I just personally don't like his playstyle because you're constantly juggling all of those songs. But I'm not going to say it's impossible to main him. He just seems to be the runt of the litter right now, just in terms of the feedback I've gotten from you guys. I've not seen many Bard mains lately, and the few of you that have mained Bard I've heard have swapped off. Now, if you are a Bard main, sound off in the comments, but yeah. And then Solarion is kind of at this weird point right now where he's the class that I'm maining at the time that I'm recording this video anyways, and he's insanely powerful. Probably the highest damage in the game, at least as far as I'm concerned, if you end up having the right abilities. Most of all, you need to have the ring ability, Prismatic something. Yeah, it basically makes it so that when you trigger your ult, your Phoenix can trigger it, and then enemies can also have the cascading effect. So what can happen is if you end up activating a Cursed Skull and you get fortunate enough to have the cascading effect trigger in the right way, it can just bang, bang, dead. Like everything just dies instantly. And so long as something spawns in quick enough to trigger the next chain in the effect, it can just devastate enemies. And he's very powerful in terms of his damage. Doesn't have much block. And unfortunately, despite that effect being very powerful, his base attack and so on and so forth is not very good. And a lot of his damage in terms of like when it comes to bosses, he's not going to be as good as say Boomer, because Boomer just has burst damage outright. Solarion, you have to kind of trigger all of your different damage over time effects and have your explosions going off. And then I'd say in that regard, he's probably stronger than Boomer, but the problem is you have to build up to that point of having over all of those effects going on. Whew, okay. I think that pretty much covers everything. Hopefully you found this video helpful. And if you did, smash like. You can sub for more, but I know most of you have already subscribed for the Trove stuff anyways. Watch my other content if you want to be nice to me, but leaving a like is invaluable. Genuinely, it helps out a lot more than you'd think. And otherwise, yeah, I hope this video was I hope it helped out in you understanding how the end game works, but then also just kind of a quick pass over all of the classes, which I'm still going to slowly experiment with trying all of them out anyways, so I can have highlight videos for you guys showing them all at the end game. But that's going to be a much larger project because don't forget there's 18 of these classes.